CSGO team. I feel like I have to tie this to the success of the League of Legends team in the summer of 2017, because both of these teams were teams that, like, I'm not going to make it too clumsy a comparison between them, but they both had similar qualities. Like, for example, the LOL team obviously was a team that underperformed. When you see how good this team was and how outrageously high the win rate was in the regular split.
All right, let's calm down on that assertion. Again, like, if you want to just take the regular season records of 17-1 and 16-2, yeah, we underperformed.
In best of 3 series.
Did we underperform relative to where expectations were
Massively.
when we signed the players at the beginning of the year? Absolutely not.
No one's thinking that when the playoffs roll around, mate. No one's like, well, what did I expect at the beginning? Well, I just hoped they'd make the playoffs, so that's cool with me, you know.
I was just hoping we would make the playoffs, and then we actually made the playoffs in a pretty dominant way. I'm happy.
Good for you, Noah. You are just a more enlightened individual than I am.
Well, I'm glad you have acknowledged it after all of these years, Duncan.
But here's the question, okay? So when the team then has this, like, basically fulfills on that in year 2, and you get to the finals, yes, this is obviously an amazing moment, and it actually did coincide with the CSGO team making the final of the major. And for people who don't know, the CSGO team were also to some degree criminal underachievers, because actually they were always ranked top 10 pretty much. They were always either hovering there or getting in and out. And there were times where in other competitions which have exactly the same teams as the major, they could place top 4, they could get wins over top teams. You know, every kind of factor was there where, well, put it this way, there's much worse teams that were in majors when this team wasn't making them, and they failed to make a number of majors. It would nearly always be in the same fashion, like very close, right at the end, didn't make it. So to get into a major, first of all, I mean, I guess the young Noah would be like, great, that's, you know, my expectations, that's all I hoped for, and once I'm there, anything can happen. But, you know, once you're there, to make a run to the final, and then the timeline of when this happened was, it was only, what, like a week, 2 weeks off from the LCS? It wasn't long, right? That the major final and the LCS final, weren't they a similar kind of time frame?
Yeah, I think they were both August 2017.
So beyond business aspects, this must have been, basically, as an owner, isn't this like the best moment of Immortals at that point in time?
Yeah, I mean, no pun intended, kind of on cloud 9. Yeah, at the same time, we lost both finals, so that hurts. But yeah, I mean, amazing, right? Like, that kind of relatively, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say the CS team were like underachievers perennially. I think they were just perennially
for not making the major for me.
They were inconsistent, right? Like, there would be tournaments where they looked like a top 5 team in the world, and then there would be tournaments where it's like, why are these guys even in Pro League?
Yes.
So, yeah, having them both make the finals at the same time was, or roughly the same time, was pretty incredible. Sure.
Because again, I mean, listen, I'm not really the sort of interviewer who asks questions about people's emotions and feelings and stuff. By the way you've answered in a very businessman-like fashion, but this is going to be another question related to essentially how you felt or what the feeling was at the time.
I mean, I can dig a little bit more into why I answer it that way, right? Like, that I think is actually an interesting point, right? Like, during 2016, I was much more emotionally involved in the successes and the failures of the League of Legends team, right? Like, when they won, would be super happy. When they lost, I'd be down. And I quickly came to the conclusion that, you know, with my role, that needed to be pretty consistently on the ball and consistently motivated, not just for the League of Legends team, but for all the other parts of the business that we're running. Like, I couldn't afford to have these swingy emotions based on competitive results. So it was actually like a very purposeful thing that I've continued up until this point, to try to emotionally disconnect myself from the competitive results of our teams, because it just affects me too much and it affects the way that I do business.
No, listen, I like that. Emotions are the enemy in some regard. If you want to have clarity of thought, I would say. But again, that's probably a separate video of my own philosophy on life. So the question I want to ask, though, was, again, not to too awkwardly tie them together, but unfortunately, the similar narrative of both teams kind of making good at the same time, unfortunately, then had a simultaneous kind of downside not that long after, because obviously you were essentially not part of the partnership program in LCS. And then in CSGO, we had this scenario where, I mean, it wasn't even just one thing. It was just that it was a a sequence of calamities, basically. You know, one thing went wrong, and then even in all the, what's funny is in all the scenarios, I think generally you took what seemed like an appropriate response, and it seemed like you tried to do the right thing to kind of stem the bleeding and move on. But this set of circumstances happened with the players, where obviously some of it centered around KNG, but you can't put it on him alone. It was the decision of the twins, Henny and Lucas, to themselves align themselves with him and then make a stand, and then eventually ask to be released. And then the whole situation of trying to sell the players, and do we make a new team? And then obviously, for people who don't know, I'm just giving people the background here, there was a lot more problems involved with that than anyone knew. Like, I think at that moment, a lot of us in the CS world realized, actually, some of these buyouts are getting really crazy now, where the buyout for a player who's never been on a tier 1 team is suddenly, you know, where you have to stop and think, is that worth that? Like, you know, how long am I getting him for? You know, there's a lot of factors that kind of, as this opened up, became a can of worms, you know, and eventually, obviously, there isn't a team anymore currently in the Immortals division of CSGO. So just on a personal level, did that connect in with the LCS one? I mean, this has to have been, if that was the best moment of Immortals, that has to kind of be the worst moment came right after, right?
It was a rough period of time, absolutely. I'd say like the one thing that I'd dig into to try and explain a little bit of that whole circumstance with the CS team and why it blew up in the way it did, despite what you're mentioning as, you know, and I still believe, like, I feel like I took the right decision at every juncture, you know, in that period in late 2017. But I think the only reason things got to that point was because I was trying, you know, you use the analogy stem the bleeding. I feel like there should have been an amputation at some point earlier.
Right.
Or like cauterizing the wound, or whatever analogy you want to use here. Where, like, for a long time, I had tried to force together players that were all of a very high skill level, but that weren't necessarily thinking about the game or about success in the same way, right? Like, as an organization, one of our underlying philosophies that we care a lot about, and that we want all of our players to care a lot about, is to be process-oriented rather than results-oriented, right? Like, as a player, you control how hard you practice, you control the way that you interact with your teammates, you control how much you sleep, and the type of food that you eat, and your level of physical fitness, but you cannot control if you win or not, right? Like, if you do everything right, you could still lose. And if you do everything wrong, you could still win. But our philosophy is that you should do everything right in your process and in your preparation to maximize the chances of winning. I think some of the players on that team, like Steel and Bolts, were very aligned with that process-oriented philosophy. And I think some of the players, like KNG and the Twins, were much more results-oriented. And this isn't speaking negatively about them. I don't think that that's a wrong way to think about it. It's just a different way to think about it. But in their minds, they always saw it as, well, we won this tournament, so why is there a problem, right? Or, yes, oh, we placed really well, so what's the issue here?
It's very much a player mentality often.
It is. It is. Although, you know, I think plenty of organizations over the years have run with a very results-oriented mindset. And so for a really long time, because I had what I thought was like a very skilled team with a lot of potential, I was very hesitant to kind of directly confront that mismatch of philosophy, right? Okay. Like, I was like, oh, we can just force this together. We can force a fit. Like, these players are good enough to win together. I'm sure it won't be an issue. They should just stick it out together and they'll eventually find success. And I think what eventually ended up happening at the tail end of 2017, when the team eventually collapsed, was those problems just became too big to bury, right? Like, those disconnects in philosophy and what players cared about and levels of professionalism, like, it was just not possible to cover those things up anymore in the name of collective success. And so, in many ways, the way things looked at the end of 2017 was a product of, I think, wrong decisions that I had made along the way. Not like individual decisions, but more just kind of a lack of willingness to confront those difficulties in the open.
So one thing I did want to pick you up on with this scenario, though, is even though in this situation, one of the reasons why I definitely feel for Immortals and sympathize with the organization is, like I say, none of the actual problems, at least the outward problems, were things directly caused by the organization. These were all player-related issues. Often they were very idiosyncratic issues of specific players and how they felt about things and decisions they might make that actually some of them I don't think anyone could have predicted. Some of them really came out of left field for many people. So when these things happened, like I say, at each stage, it seemed like you took the appropriate professional action. There wasn't any sort of like high emotion, it didn't seem, in terms of how you were making decisions. But nevertheless, as you say, sometimes you can do things right and you don't get the result you want. You can still have a result that comes out as a negative in the end. One thing that did confuse me, though, was this situation with 100 Thieves, where the players were sold to 100 Thieves, and 100 Thieves, if they hadn't have had their own problems, which were totally unconnected, would absolutely have gone to that next major, and they would have competed with essentially what were your players before. Now, this is what I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
Right. Initially, when I heard this was even a possibility, that you might just basically sell 3 of the 5, and for anyone who doesn't know, if you have 3 of the 5 players in Counter-Strike, you get the major spot. So basically, it doesn't matter that Immortals has a team they want to field, it would be 100 Thieves or whoever had bought them, the 3 players that would get the slot. Now, in this scenario, when I heard that was even a possibility, I thought, oh, okay, does that mean then that the contracts were going to run out anyway? And so, it wasn't your choice as it was, you would have had to re-sign these players or lose them anyway. But the implication from other people was actually some of these players would have still been under contract to the major. And so it was kind of, to some degree, your decision to allow these players to go. And more importantly, and this is the point I want to ask about, to go all to one place. Because the other option you could have done, which I think would have been absolutely fair, like to some degree, I realise it's not the sort of thing you can be like, yep, you're right, Thorin, publicly about, but I do think that sometimes players get too much kind of too much bias from fans, and fans want everything to be the player's way. And I'll give you an abstract
can be pretty
example.
Biased in the paper.
Without giving specifics, I'll give you an abstract example. If I hear that some small team has got a player who turns in 3 months into the best player in the world, and now he wants to leave, and the team's like, well, we've got you under contract. When fans are like, oh, this is just such bullshit, I want to go to the fan. Come on, mate, what do you think the best case scenario for that team was? Obviously, you want that player to be amazing and be on your team. Like, think of his, that is a person there. It's not just some McDonald's, some corporation that's faceless and just evil, That's the best case scenario for this guy. Well, sadly, they are legally. That's half the problem. But, okay. What I'm tying into...
You and I can get into a full debate about corporate personhood at some point off recording.
What I'm tying into, though, is that in this scenario, I think, bearing in mind how fair you were to some of these players and how much you really went out of your way to keep them in the org, and then essentially they were quite explicit, no, we want to leave... There's a world in which I thought a fair way to do it might have been, okay, I'll sell you, but I'll only sell 2 of you to one team and 1 to the other, and we'll make a deal. None of us get the major spot. That's fair, right? Why should any of us have it? I don't want to lose it. I didn't do anything to lose it. You guys can't have it because, unfortunately, you want to leave in these circumstances that are, to some degree, acrimonious. It's not what I'd hoped for. That might be a way to do it. So is it the case that you had the choice to do this? Like, you could have dissolved the major spot, as it were, and then anyone could have competed and they could have qualified for it, whatever. Is it the case that you were just incredibly magnanimous and allowed these players to basically have your major spot and go off to another team, and they would have competed with that and then come what may? What would you say to this topic?
I mean, there's a lot to unwind in there, right? So first, let's establish the factual basis. After what happened with KNG, he was fully released. So he was not under contract with us. The 3 players that were under contract with us, even while they were no longer actively playing for us, were FNX, Henny, and Lucas. So FNX remained under contract with us even after he was no longer playing for us. The other answer is their contracts, still would not have expired. Like, they would still be under contract with us today. They signed long-term contracts. It was definitely within our legal right to not let them go and play for a different team. But I would say there are 2 reasons why we didn't do that, and 2 reasons why we didn't piece them out and just dissolve the major slot. Like, one is, I'm not a dick, right? Like, I'm not King Solomon trying to saw the baby in half so that nobody gets it. And second is just the business rationale of, like, selling the contracts of Henny and Lucas and FNX, who all wanted to play together, to a team, and then letting them pick up KNG. Like, there's a strong financial incentive for me to do that rather than letting the major slot disappear in smoke.
Okay.
So absolutely, with 100 Thieves, like, we transferred FNX, Henny, and Lucas's contracts to them. We were very clear, like, we can't force KNG to sign with you guys, but KNG and those 3 players have been planning to play together ever since stepping down from our active roster anyway.
Okay. What did you, just as an outsider, what did you think of the situation that happened with 100 Thieves as an outsider? Because obviously they had their own series of calamities where, first of all, they didn't get to the major because of visa issues. And then after that, basically something of a repeat of history with similar problems with social media, and then eventually the lineup broke up, and again it was piece by piece by piece. It was never one thing overnight, really.
Yeah. I mean, look, I have a lot of respect for 100 Thieves and their management, not just Nade, but even the guys behind the scenes. Like, I like them all. I think they're good people. It's unfortunate that things didn't work out. I actually think that in the long term, that team could have been a really good fit for that organization, just in like, the things that they're passionate about and the way that they conduct themselves, not in like a negative way, right? But like, Henny, look, if there was a Nade Shot vlog with like Henny, Lucas, and KNG and FNX, that sounds like a really entertaining vlog. I would watch that.
Yes.
And I'm sad that I never got that vlog. With that said, right, like Vito did the things he did with us. It's not particularly surprising to me that those things popped up again. I probably wouldn't choose to sign Vito if I was signing a new team. But I don't hate any of them as people, right? Like,
sure. I
don't like FNX, Lucas, Henny, Vito. Like, I still stay in contact with those guys. Like I still count them as, I don't know if we were ever friends because I was their boss, right? But like, yes. I still count them as people that I care about and I would like good things to happen to. So there's no, at least from my side, there's no hard feelings there.
What do you think from the business side, though? Because I actually think it's like, this is one of the reasons why I sometimes get saddened at fan reactions. It's not that fans don't have the information and they make the wrong decision. Okay, that's their own prerogative entirely. And they might just disagree with me. But I was really disappointed by some fans who were sort of like blamed 100 Thieves, really. Whereas actually, I have to say, I would actually give a lot of credit to 100 Thieves because that is a very bold statement along the lines of what you were saying earlier about the idea of having certain values in your organization, that you're willing to release a team that you paid a lot of money for and that literally never played a single game for you. That's like, a cynical businessman would say, hey, well, I'm at least going to ride this out and get my money's worth before I end this, They instantly released the whole squad.
Yeah, that was a little weird to me. I don't know why that happened, but it's not my business, and I don't know a ton of the details about how they operate behind the scenes. So hard for me to comment on that. I unlike a Twitter analyst, I'm a retired Twitter analyst. I don't try to make assumptions about things that I don't know about.
Well, I'll stick to your own strengths, So some of us are better at crypto. We've got all the facts. No.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, Duncan, you have made a reputation for yourself with your ability to analyze without the full.
It's not always accurate.
Basis.
I'll guarantee you, it's not always accurate. But here's the funny thing. I mean, I don't want to sound too arrogant here, but one of the bizarre things I have noticed is sometimes when I'm totally off the money is what prompts people, because they see the opening, to say, you're wrong, to actually then reveal what the real information is. So somehow it works out. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not claiming I pioneered it all, but it just works out in the end.
You're process oriented, right? You're giving yourself the best chance to get it right.
Sometimes you can do everything wrong and get the right results. Like you told me earlier, I've actually learned retroactively from this interview, believe it or not. So
I mean, that's pretty much the process with which a lot of investigative journalists work in the space.
Absolutely. So. Yes. Like, here's the question though, is now, If only what was in theory publicly known, like officially, was on record, I could ask you all sorts of questions now, like, do you regret having Brazilian players? Should this tie into the question before? Should you have a North American team, right? But being as people know some of the things that potentially are in the works or that are rumored and whatnot, the better question, I think, is to ask about something you can actually give me an answer about, which is, okay, so we had this announcement that
I can give you an answer to anything, Duncan.
You can. But whether you will or not, and whether it's an interesting one that I want to hear, is an entirely different topic. So here's the question. So obviously you've hired Lurpis, Tommy Kovan, who is someone who not only is been a long-time friend of mine, but is obviously famously a former professional for many years in CS 1.6, then is better known as semi-journalist, analyst, commentator in CSGO. And so obviously
Twitter analyst, never forget Twitter
absolutely
analyst.
Absolutely a Twitter analyst. Yep. Even worse than that, he analyzes just random things people say to him. That tilts me sometimes. It's just a permanent AMA that never ends. He can't get out, can't opt out of that one unless I unfollow him. So,
I've unfollowed him a few times.
You did, yeah. There's been times where it's rattled me a little bit. I can't lie. Right, okay. So what I'm getting to here, though, is, okay, it makes total sense on the grounds of why, if you want someone to be in a position where they're going to be like a general manager and they might have decisions over Counter-Strike, yes, this is someone who obviously has a long tenure. I can understand the background. But the question I have for you is this. Does the fact that he's being hired in this position, is it like a sports GM? Is he really someone who now will be given responsibility to plan out the long-term future of a CSGO division in Immortals, like deciding what players or deciding who to target a year from now, these things? Because put it this way, just as an aside, since I can say this since I'm friends with him, if I was talking with him and we were talking about the NBA or the NFL, he is someone who absolutely, believe me, would not like give a political answer if it was like a team did badly and he thought the GM did the bad results. He would absolutely say that guy was trash. What does he think of this move? So if he is given this responsibility, I'm just saying it does come with the fact that we should all absolutely be able to either congratulate him on his success or tell him he's fucking terrible if he does the wrong moves, right?
Oh, come on. Independent of whether he's that type of person or not, you're still going to call him terrible if he makes the wrong moves. Look, I think...
Does it have that level of scope, though, the role?
No, so I think there's a little bit of misperception publicly about what GM means, and this is fair, right? Because GM has a very particular meaning in sports, but it has a different meaning in business. So when we think of GMs in the context of our organization, we view GMs as the link between the competitive and the business operations of the team. So yes, Tommy has involvement in roster decisions and involvement in the competitive fortunes of the team, but his core role as CSGO GM is to help us run the business operations of the CSGO division. So not just what teams are we picking up, but how are we selling sponsorships? How are we doing events? What's the type of content that we should be making around this? Because to be frank, like not everyone in Immortals knows everything about every game, right? Like our head of content comes mostly from Dota and then had to learn about Overwatch and now has to learn about Counter-Strike or mobile games or whatever the case might be. So the reason we have these GMs is to be a resource on the ground across our content team, our marketing team, our social media team, and really be that plug-in for the business operations of the organization into the competitive and kind of unique game aspects that each division has.
Just for clarification, you are someone who would be in favor of something like a franchise model for Counter-Strike?
Yeah, I would.
Right, along those lines then, aside from, as I touched to with the any LCS owners who also could have been in Overwatch, like, yes, certainly you could raise the money to be in probably every league. Therefore, if you want to be, why not be in all the ones you think make sense? Right? You don't really have to ask the question of then why are you in Counter-Strike? I think that's kind of a stupid question in the light of the context I just said. But in the more literal sense of the current climate, why does no Whinston want to be in Counter-Strike if at the moment the model isn't necessarily the one that you'd consider ideal? And again, actually Counter-Strike is the game where I am the most sympathetic towards owners, because I know that some of them are in very tough spots when it comes to competing over salaries and having to re-sign even the players you've currently got. And then this is an area where there isn't really the same path work laid out. Like, as much as anyone can criticize the Overwatch League, at least there is a vision there. There's a notion that we might be able to get you these profits in year X or whatever. In Counter-Strike, everything could be God in terms of results tomorrow, and there's no promises basically at all, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Why be in a Counter-Strike, basically?
So first, I'm just going to note that on that topic, I have many things to say about Richard's article about organizations leaving Counter-Strike, but we'll leave that for later. So with Counter-Strike, I think a lot of our desire to be involved in this game was very much informed by one of our strategic investors, AEG. So AEG is like one of the largest entertainment and venue companies in the world. They own multiple professional sports teams. They own music festivals. They own tons of venues, including the Staples Center and LA Live, London O2, like everything, right? They are the biggest. And if you look at the way that AEG operates, they own these professional teams. They own the Los Angeles Kings. They own the Los Angeles Galaxy. But like, those teams are not the core of their business. Those teams help to power the other aspects of their business. So when they have teams, that means they get to fill their venues. When they have teams, that means they get to sell tickets on their ticketing platform, or put content on their content platform, or sell sponsorships across them with their sponsorships team that also sells sponsorships across their venues. And so there's kind of this economy of scale that happens when you have these teams, but you also have all the other infrastructure surrounding it. And I think that's what has really informed our desire to be involved in Counter-Strike. Not because we think that like the current decentralized system is amazing for the game. Like I think it's actually really bad for the game, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But I think that very specifically in Counter-Strike, we saw an opportunity with a particular team, with a particular level of scale, to then not just have the team and sell sponsorships across the team and call it a day, but to have a team and then build all the other pieces of infrastructure around it. And I think that's actually very similar to how the guys at Refresh and Blast are thinking about it, right? They're not involved with Astralis just because they love owning a team and they want to own this team. They're involved with Astralis, but then they also have, their commercial division, and then they also have their events, and they have all these other pieces of infrastructure surrounding the team. And that's what I think a mature and nuanced and sophisticated CSGO business model can look like. And I think we really want to test that to see if that can be successful, because if it is successful in Counter-Strike, and if you can build that in Counter-Strike, then you can also build that in Overwatch. You can also build that in Dota. You can build that other places.
Do you get the sense from the other owners in Counter-Strike that they share this sentiment? Or are there people, for example, who might say to me, oh, that's just sour grapes because he wants to be in a franchise model, and maybe there's people in CS who are like, hey, I love the Wild Wild West approach and I want to be able to just have it up and down. And I don't know, I'm not sure what their motivation would be, but maybe there's someone who that's their bag. What's your sense from other people in Counter-Strike?
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to be clear that what I'm talking about in terms of the building of infrastructure is somewhat disconnected from a franchise model, right? Like, you don't really need a franchise model in order to do that, but having a franchise model does give you more stability and does give you kind of more centralization of all of your efforts. So we're going ahead in Counter-Strike, and we're going ahead with this plan, even though there is no franchise model. Do I think that other people in Counter-Strike are thinking about it the same way? I mean, I think the guys at Refresh and Astralis and Blast are. Beyond that, not from what I've seen, but it's definitely possible that each of those teams might have their own kind of behind-the-scenes business models that I'm just not super aware of.
So let's touch on what you briefly picked up on there.
Actually, I would say ES Force, right? Like, those guys own Counter-Strike teams. They have Epicenter. So they're kind of building their own kind of unified infrastructure, too. I forgot about that.
Okay. So to touch on and to expand, though, what you had touched on earlier, where Richard did this article about a bunch of the teams leaving, obviously triggered by Splice leaving and the owner coming out and making these statements, but he made it more of a broad thing as well. I mean, he literally did just tell basically everyone sort of like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Like, it's not like he did.
That's a literal quote from the article.
It is, yes. That's why I said it like that. That's not me like playing it up in my own fashion. Like, that's real. But what I would tie this to is this has been something that's been an undercurrent that's been there for the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years in Counter-Strike, actually, even before you got involved. Because I remember, again, some of the organizations that I do talk to and some of the people that actually, again, I sympathize with because I have an idea of what the salaries are and then what they're actually making as profit from some of these games. And I know that some of them, especially in a world without a franchise model, are sort of gambling. And then the next year it's like, oh, we're gambling again. Cool. I guess we have to do that again. And next year as well. Well, yes, I guess I'll, they're sort of in and they don't want to pull out at this point in time. They don't want to cut their losses necessarily. So this is the question. I know in the past, not only have orgs left, because there was obviously that flurry where everyone came in. And at the time, admittedly, every esport was a similar landscape. So it wasn't quite the same. But now, not only have we had some leave, but I know the last couple of years, there were even some who stayed in the game, but then scaled back or just stayed at the same place and therefore it seemed like they scaled back because other people went above and beyond, especially some of the crazy figures we've heard from Europe for some of the salaries. But with that said, I will point out, I do know that a couple of the NA orgs themselves sort of like went back in towards the higher end as well. So I don't want to make it like it was a year ago where it was a very clear sort of distinction where the NA orgs, who by the way tend to be the Overwatch League and the LCS people, tended to have a different philosophy and seemed like they were waiting either for a franchise model or to decide to pull out. It's not quite as clear cut as that for anyone who's watching now, but there has clearly been this trend of where some people, you'll note a lot of the people who are paying the massive salaries and have gone all out, really have gone all out. This is the game that they're involved in, and they don't have a League of Legends team and they don't have a Overwatch League team, and they've only gone into this one esport, and for whatever reasons they decided this is the space for them, and they seem to appreciate the way things are going at the moment while they've got the players and the teams. I'll note, like, that is certainly an aspect I'd like to see in a few years if someone else comes in.
I also don't know if that's true, right? Like, who were the orgs that you would name as like the highest paying orgs, right? Like G2, VP.
Yeah, North, SK Gaming, Virtus Pro.
Yeah, so like, SK and North are pretty much Counter-Strike only, but G2 is pretty big in League of Legends. VP has a very strong Dota team. But anyway, I actually don't know if I had much of a point to make there. So sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
It's okay. So let me think where I was. Okay, so basically the question is this, like, in line with that, obviously Richard took a very hard line on that. I mean, literally, even in his phrasing, there wasn't really a lot of sort of room.
Well, I see you've met Richard.
Interpretation in that. But what would you say to this issue? Because on the one hand, obviously you haven't left Counter-Strike. You've given no intention you have. In fact, all rumors suggest you will continue to remain in Counter-Strike. And this is, I mean, for a start off, hiring someone like Lopez in itself would be an indication you will. Not least because I'm pretty sure he knows nothing about any of the other games you're involved with, quite frankly. So it's, I can't even pretend on that one for them.
Tommy's learning Overwatch already.
Yes, he'll exactly. Yes, I've noticed he's the sniping's cut down a little bit on that. So what I will say is this. People might think, though, you are someone yourself who might have been in a position over the last few years where you thought these thoughts. Is it worth putting as much investment into the Counter-Strike side of things? Should I maybe even pull out? I mean, listen, I wouldn't have blamed you if after the scenario with the 100 Thieves thing, you thought, hey, what a great time to get out. At least I got some money at the end. Things went badly. Maybe at that point in time, maybe there isn't as clear a team to pick up. What would you say to this topic overall? Because it seems like it's obviously a topic that people are going to have very different opinions on. So where do you come down on it?
So, and there's a lot to unpack here, both about our business and about the state of the Counter-Strike market. So I do want to dive into this in detail. I think it's really interesting. So first off, I'd note that we did kind of pull out, right? Like we transferred Steel to Liquid, we transferred Bolts to SK, we transferred 3 of our other players to 100 Thieves, and like we haven't had a CS team since end of last year. Sure. So in some ways we did pull out. Basically, what I'm seeing right now is that the Counter-Strike market is like on the precipice of going through some major difficulties. And it hasn't happened yet. And so I understand a little bit where Richard is coming from. But from what I've seen in like the salary market, there is not about to be like a collapse or anything, but like a lot of the assumptions that players and pundits have had over the last few years are just really no longer the case, right? Like, essentially what happened over the last few years is like salaries for the top players scaled up pretty quickly. And, I'm not saying anything that hasn't already been rumored in public. So there's literally no inside information at play here. But like salaries for the top players scaled from like the 10 or 12K range up to the like 20K-ish range per month. And so kind of everyone's assumption was that would correspond to everyone else's salary scaling up, right? Like the guys that were making 10K were then making 20K. So the guys that were making 6K should now make like 15K, right?
Yes.
Unfortunately, like that's not really what happened, because those top teams are where most of the sponsorship dollars are concentrated, and sponsorships are really like the main driver of revenue for organizations right now, right? Like, sure, you can make some money on merchandising and you can make some money from your content, but realistically, like sponsorships are where teams are making most of their money right now. And if you're like a HyperX or a Razer or a Logitech, and you have to pick between like G2 CSGO or VP CSGO or let's even like take Astralis, right, who's probably playing like the best team in the world right now, and or like FaZe CSGO or any of those, right? Like if you have the choice between them or like a top 15 team that doesn't really have a ton of like social engagement or good numbers around them, like you're always going to pick the better team, right? And so there's kind of this disproportionate flow of revenue dollars to the top teams in the ecosystem. And then on the lower side, right, like there's a revenue model there even for the lower teams, right? If you're like an LDLC and you have the 3rd or 4th best French team, or you are I don't know, I'm trying to come up with other good, I mean, let's even say like former CLG or like Selfless when Selfless was still around. Selfless is a great example, right? Like you can definitely make a business model work by being a smaller team and paying lower salaries and just trying to scout and develop talent, right? You're not going to get big sponsor dollars, but you're going to be able to sell that talent to the better teams. And that is a business model that can sustain you, right? Like, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that business model, right? Like, you talked about a bad team that has a good player on it, and then the player becomes really good. Like, yeah, like there's a world in which it makes a ton of sense to sell that player. Sure, it hurts your team, but if you try to force that player to stay on, right, maybe you only have a year left on his contract, and it takes more than a year sometimes to sell sponsorships. So by the time you can even sell a sponsorship, that player is going to leave your team anyway. So you might as well make your revenue model around like the transfer fees that you get from moving players onto better teams, right? And Selfless has done that really well. I think LDLC has done it pretty well. I mean, a lot of organizations do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that the middle ground is really, really hard for organizations right now. Because if you're in the like range of paying your guys $10,000 a month right now, like sure, sometimes you can sell those players to better organizations, right? Like we transferred many players, not many players, I think just 2 players, Phelps and Bolt, to SK Gaming over the course of our time with that team. But the transfer fees aren't really high enough to sustain that level of salary. But you also don't really have the consistent competitive finishes or the consistent like big names as part of your organization to be able to collect a lot of sponsorship revenue. And so that middle ground is really tough. And in the days after we parted ways with our team, right? Honestly, and you know, this wasn't public, but there were definitely some disputes around like renegotiation of contract and level of salary as part of that. And so it became clear that like our expectations of where these guys' salaries would be after renewal was not necessarily aligned with what they were looking to get. And so even in the days after I parted ways with that team, we saw a lot of rosters approach us with like pretty decent names on it, right? Like names that people would know. Okay. That were all like roughly top 10 to top 20 ranked in the world, right? Like fine teams, not bad teams, but not world beater teams. And they were all looking for salaries in like the 10 to 14K per month range, and none of them got organizations. So what's in danger right now is not the really cheap teams that are kind of talent farms for the better teams. And the best teams in the world are doing fine, right? They're making a lot more money. They have a lot of sponsor dollars. There's value there. The threat to the Counter-Strike ecosystem is what happens to the teams in the middle. And yeah, like CLG leaving, Splice leaving, there are absolutely instances of organizational mismanagement and like, sure, like they could have done better with their teams. Yes, Richard is not wrong. But I also think that writing it off as like the only reason that these organizations are leaving is because they're not good enough to hack it in Counter-Strike, like that's ridiculous. There are massive fundamental issues with the current structure of the Counter-Strike ecosystem that are leading to that. And that doesn't mean the game's going to die, right? Like Richard's right. The game will be just fine without those organizations. There will still be plenty of fans. But like there's more to the ecosystem than how many people are watching it, right? Like sure, everyone could cut their salaries by 90% and they would still have just as many people watching the game as they did before. Yeah. But the players don't want to cut their salaries by 90%. It doesn't matter that just as many people would be watching. That's not the end goal, right? Like we need to have higher salaries for players to make it a realistic career for them. We need to have significant financial investment into events to make those events have higher production value. We need to have investment into talent development, or else like what happens when the current crop of top players retires? Who will replace them? So like there are significant structural issues in the Counter-Strike ecosystem that are continually going unaddressed because people are too focused on this short term, right? There's massive oversaturation of events. The players have no time to practice or rest because they're constantly competing. There is no organized system of talent development. And all of these issues in the long term will come back to bite the Counter-Strike ecosystem, like whether or not it still has 1 million people watching the majors.
Okay. What about this then? Because when you brought that topic up there, and specifically you brought it up that, you know, there was rosters and they had expectations that were somewhat unrealistic, as shown by the fact that it's not like, you know, you wouldn't pay and you were like, oh, it's not worth it, and then they just went to someone else and they did pay. No, I've no doubt some of them didn't get anywhere close to what they wanted. It seems like one of the problems here does stem from the fact that, understandably, players don't have the same understanding of the industry and they don't necessarily know what is a reasonable expectation. And sadly, I can tell you, this is one area where a lot of players, because their job is just play, and that's what they specialize in, spend all their day thinking about playing, a lot of them have not moved on from where I knew players' mentalities to be over a decade ago. I'd go maybe even a bit further, where a player will really think to himself, my salary and what I get from my org should be based on A, where I'm finishing in tournaments right now, today, even though if you even stop for a second, logically, you know, we didn't make the deal today, did we, with the sponsor? So I would that it could be that way, mate. And also, I will point out, just for my own humour, they don't ever want to go the other way, do they? You know what, boss, just cut my salary, did terrible in that last tournament. You know, it's funny, it doesn't go both ways, I'll say that. Yep. But the other aspect is, they then also simultaneously, even if you could explain that part to them, like, listen, you know, that's not the way this sponsor contract works. And, yes, if you have more success, maybe I can spin it in the next years. The other problem is there's the aspect of like keeping up with the Joneses. They look at the other team and they go, hey, wait a minute, I'm better than that player, or we're better than that team. And what he gets 17,000 and we get whatever it might be, 11,000. How does this make sense? I mean, again, it does in the industry, but to the player, I get why to him on an individual level, he sees this doesn't make sense. Shouldn't I be paid for how good I am and this sort of thing? Why do you think there's still a disconnect between players and teams here? Because the thing is, the team owners, are having plenty of chances to talk to players. I'm sure there are times it all seems like everything's great, but there does seem to be a disconnect. I'm talking even in the biggest teams and the smallest.
For sure.
Feels like generally players aren't on the same page in that sense.
Yeah, well, the one thing that I'll just tack on to what you're saying about how, the keeping up with the Joneses issue, like, it's even worse than that in professional Counter-Strike right now, right? Because the guys that are making 10K, they don't want to, like, look small compared to their friends. So they tell all their friends they're making 12K. Okay. So then those guys are like, oh, well, they're making 12K.
We've got fantasy inflation as well, even worse.
Yeah, it's bad. It's bad. It's really bad. And I know, right, because I've seen some of these player contracts, and, like, I know that they're not making what they're telling other people they're making. So it's bad. So why is there a disconnect? Well, I've given a TEDx talk before about Marxist political theory and esports.
I'll have to look that one up.
It's a great video. You should find it. I think
I'll enjoy it no matter what I can
tell. But there is, and there should inherently always be a disconnect between team owners and players, right? Like, at some level, we are not on the same side.
Self-interest, obviously, yeah.
Right, like in inherent to, and this is where you'll probably roll your eyes at me, but like kind of inherent to any capitalist system, right? Like the employer and the employee are not aligned and probably should not be aligned,
sure.
Right? Like I am paying you to provide a service, and you are providing that service not out of loyalty to me, not because you want to build this company in which you hold no ownership, but because I am paying you to provide the service. So I don't want the players to trust me. I just want these players to get some agents. Right? Like Overwatch League, almost all of the players have agents. And that has done so much to professionalize and to help set expectations and to really like educate players in what they are worth and why they are worth that much. In Counter-Strike, like none of the players have agents. They almost always negotiate entirely by themselves without any broader information beyond what they get through the gossip mill. And like what I saw your video with Scott, right? Like, and Scott is a really cool dude. I like him, despite being on the opposite side of him of some arguments. But like a players' association doesn't fill that role. The players need individual agents. They need lawyers. They probably need financial advisors. Like none of them have them. None of them. Very, very, very few. And I don't know why. I don't know why in this game, for some reason, players just don't have representation.
Let's talk about the topic you just touched on briefly there, though, just by invoking Sir Scoots, as it were, which is that there could have been steps towards some of the business models you might have liked if PEA had come to be and if it had been an online league. And this is a factor where I think Scoots even himself admitted it in the interview. This wasn't really a scenario where it was like, no one wanted the league to exist. It's just execution that got in the way of this. Certain things were mishandled, and that meant that as a result, it doesn't exist. Whereas perhaps if a softer approach, more of a long-term approach had been rolled out, it would exist, and then it would become whatever everyone had hoped for it to be. Did you kind of see that as bricks along the path to having this something of a franchise model, or something that as a team, for example, you could be sharing revenue, etc., beyond the I consider fairly paltry deals that currently exist in the context of what can exist for franchising?
Yeah, look, like there's no doubt that the whole PEA situation was mishandled from an execution perspective. I bear plenty of that blame, but that doesn't mean that I think the concept was bad. And ultimately, what made it fall apart, again, was never that the players didn't want to participate in PEA League. They just wanted to participate in PEA League simultaneously to ESL Pro League and to ECS.
Yes.
And to E-League. And our assertion at the time, and what I still believe to be true, is that it just did not make financial sense for us to start up like a third concurrent seasonal online league. Like, it was not worth the amount of money that we would need to invest into it to make it happen. It was not worth the strain on the players' schedules and the time it would take away from sponsor activation and streaming. And so our assertion was never, I never thought the players didn't want the PEA League. It was clear that they just wanted it in addition to everything else they already had. And our assertion was like, it doesn't really work that way. Like, you kind of got to pick one or the other. And they picked. And fair enough. I think it was the wrong choice. I think more and more players are starting to realize it was the wrong choice, but what's done is done.
Maybe we could just briefly address that then, because this is the thing, okay? This is one of the reasons I think why this is one of those very weird scenarios where what happened when all that was taking place was, obviously you had Sir Scoots, the players, the fans, Richard, pretty much everyone against the teams and the PEA. And bizarrely, I was on the side of the PEA in as much as I was giving a voice to people involved in it and people noting my videos. It's not actually that I was like biased in favor of the PEA. I actually tried to be objective, which means you try to find what the truth is and put that out there, So I will say I definitely am a lot more sympathetic towards orgs than some other people in my position or who aren't in orgs, basically. There are a lot of people who unfortunately, because they look at the individual, they say, oh, I want just the player to get everything and the fan to get everything, Whereas I say, well, yeah, guess what? There's people in these orgs as well. Shouldn't they have self-interest? Shouldn't they want to succeed and get their slice of the pie,
Right. And like, where do you think the player salaries come from, right? Like, you think I just snap my fingers and pull that money out of thin air because I'm a big fan of Counter-Strike? Like, some organizations are run that way. They're hobby projects. But like, most of the organizations that you see in the space, whether it's Immortals or SK or G2 or VP or Astralis, like, these are businesses and they are being run to not just make money and not just like be passionate about the space that we're involved in, but to like build something bigger. And that means like we're all spending a lot of money on things that are not just our player salaries, and we need to be able to make more money than our player salaries cost, or else like it is not a very justifiable business.
And obviously to have a level of stability, because Counter-Strike, more than any other game, forget like the idea of people being afraid of being relegated from LCS. You just mess up a couple of tournaments or don't get through an online qualifier, you're not even in the equivalent of whatever the LCS is for this week in Counter-Strike. It's incredibly volatile. So in terms of the idea of putting in long-term investment, at the moment, I don't blame someone who doesn't if they were to say, I'll go with the safer option of another game, which, by the way, if you're a Counter-Strike fan, think about how alarming that is, that for all the criticism of the Overwatch League, it's considered a safer, more stable route potentially than investing in Counter-Strike. So if everyone wants to bag on the Overwatch League, think about what that means back in your own home, as it were. So what I want to get to was what you alluded to there, which is part of the issue was, unfortunately, some of it on PEA's side, because it became an ultimatum and it became EPL or PEA, and the players obviously went with EPL and they got their way and they're in EPL now, and there is no PEA. As a result, while yes, we can't promise that PEA would have been amazing because we don't know. It was never rolled out. We never saw the actual numbers. The problem is, it's not like EPL really seems like it has a trajectory at this point in time. Like, it kind of seems like, did you want what you currently had? Well, it's almost like, the cursed monkey paw scenario where you get that, but just forever. It's just this forever. Or eventually it's not even ESL dies and then it's not that anymore. And maybe there is no EPL. So
you get what you had with like 20% of the viewership because it's on Facebook now.
What would you say to that topic generally? Because this is a problem I had at the time, which is even though EPL I noticed Scoots at the time claimed that in some way the players could make more money. I never quite understood that because when I looked at the maths, it seemed like the prize money, etc., was significantly higher in PEA. But okay, they tried to bill it that the money's not the issue. But my issue really was for players. If you really think you're going to be a pro in 5 years, where will EPL go? Because I don't see what the path, especially not a path that goes hand in hand with players and orgs, I could see ASL maybe making it a huge thing. So again, listen, I'll be fair to ESL. Great for ESL. I'd love to run my own league and be the guy who makes all the revenue. Sounds great. But again, How does everyone else come along with us on this yellow brick road?
Sure. So look, I think that's a little bit minimizing what the player's argument actually was, right? Which I think was a fair argument, both in retrospect and in the moment, right? Their argument was not, look, like, we want to have our cake and eat it too. Their argument was dropping out of ESL, which is a league that has been stable and been paying us for a really long time, for this league that is completely unproven, with no guarantee that it will exist for more than a year. Like, sure, the money might be better in year one, but what happens in year two if you just, like, get rid of the PEA league, but ESL isn't there anymore because we all dropped out of their league? Very fair argument, right? And this is where execution was an issue. We absolutely should have addressed that in a better way than we did. And if we had, maybe we'd be living in a very different world now. I also would note that, like, I've recently gone back and reread all of the Medium posts and the back and forth between Scott and I, which is great reading. And for those of you that didn't know, I was writing those from like a hotel in China at 4 a.m. because I was often in Hangzhou with our League of Legends team visiting the LGD headquarters.
Okay.
So I am still impressed by myself that I managed to pull off that level of PR writing from a hotel in China.
I will say, by the way, that is the one aspect. Listen, I'm actually also sympathetic to the players' position. I understand their own self-interest, but I will say one aspect that I actually do say, like, fuck the players on is like, you did that on Christmas Day. Like, I was actually on holiday myself somewhere, and I had to be dragged out of bed to do a fucking interview with Reginald at like. I was in Korea as well, so it was at like, 8 a.m. or something. I didn't really appreciate that myself either, actually. I'd rather we could have all done this on a weekday during a normal month and we all had time to waste on this bullshit,
Look, I'm sympathetic, right? Look, they felt, and I know this both from
it was a great leverage point, listen.
It wasn't just a leverage point, right? Like, I know from talking to the players and from talking to Scott, right? Like, they felt like they were under attack. They felt like if they delayed anymore, they were going to give up all their rights and be forced to participate in a league that they didn't want to participate in. I will, at any point you want, talk more in detail about why it is absurd that players under contract with an organization should be able to pick what tournaments they play in, but we can get more into that later. But, I think the concept of PEA was good. There were certainly executional elements that could have been done better. The idea of profit share versus revenue share, the number of guaranteed seasons of the league, the way we communicated with players. But in concept, I think it was a good idea. And I think, frankly, if you ask a lot of the players, or if you ask Scott whether it was a good idea, and maybe I'm betraying how, I might have skipped around during your video with Scott if you did talk about this. But I think all of them would agree that in concept it was fine. It was just the execution that was the issue. And, at this point, not much we can do about that. But I at least am walking away from that experience with the knowledge that, like, the concept of that type of league where team owners and players are the real stakeholders, I think that can still work. I don't know if it will ever exist again, but I think it could.
Okay. Right, a couple of points along what you've just said there. And I'll just preface it by saying there's no snark involved in these questions. These are not intended to be semi-rude rhetorical questions, right? So one question would be this, and this is a real thing I thought in the moment of the PEA. I actually think one of the biggest failures of the PEA, beyond perhaps who was hired to negotiate some of the deals and how aggressively they pursued them, and again, what they thought they could get away with and it turned out in the end didn't. That's certainly a separate issue. But one area I remember bringing up in my video, because it was kind of weird no one addressed this, is the people who the players essentially are on the opposite side of are their own teams and their own team owners in this particular issue in terms of who wants what. So the part that I did find was strange was some of these team owners are guys where I have a lot of faith in these guys' ability to negotiate, to be able to sell people on a vision, because they do it on a daily basis. They go and sell some massive company to get part of the sponsor budget. They sell someone on the idea of investing in the business, and that's going to be a big thing, or that we're going to be part of a league that's going to be a big thing that doesn't exist yet. So was there not some degree to which it was kind of also a failure of the owners to be able to sell their own players on this issue? I mean, these are people you could call directly. I think about that in a negotiation deal. No middleman. You could call this guy up and say, listen, here's why it's a great thing, and I know in the short term these issues, don't worry, we can get... Wasn't there something of a problem there that the teams basically weren't able to convince these players that were their own players?
I think it's a little more complex than that, Duncan. Like, from my perspective, and of course I don't have perfect information about what happened at every team, it's just that, like, for the majority of our planning for this league, there was not significant pushback from the players, right? Like, it was not like they were rioting in the streets for 6 months before we ever talked to them about this, right? For the most part, like, the most vehement opposition happened when it went public. And certainly I'm sure that there were some concerns that should have been addressed more fully, and I'm sure there were some players that spoke up that weren't really listened to. Like, I don't have direct knowledge of that, but it would add up to me. But at the same time, it's not like there was some sort of coordinated campaign in which the owners all went to their players and was like, hey, you should want to do this. And the players were like, no. And then the owners just said, too bad, right? From the perspective of the owners during that whole debacle, I think I can call it, like, we were surprised when the players reacted so strongly in public, because the reactions in private had not been anywhere near that level of intensity.
Sure.
that's kind of why I'd put it that way. Like, I think there was not a huge coordinated effort to sell the players on this idea until after it had gone public, frankly, because we didn't realize it was necessary.
So the other thing was the part that you touched on there about the idea that a player would have the right to choose the tournament he plays in. Now, what's interesting about this is, I would guess generally, despite the fact, again, most fans, because, you know, they're just fans of the players and they maybe don't know a lot about business, and they've obviously never run a business themselves, a lot of them, they would think naively, because even if they put themselves in that position, they're thinking of the position of being a worker. Well, they understand what it's like to work for a boss, etc. Yeah, everyone wishes they had more autonomy and they could choose every aspect of their work and the direction and so on. So generally, I would say we're actually probably aligned on this. Like, I do think it's kind of nuts that you sign a player, you convince someone to give you all the money to be able to pay this player, you pay him his great salary, send him to the tournaments, and he's like, I'd rather choose not to compete in this league. It's like, oh, that's just cute as all hell, isn't it? You little... God damn it. You know, like in that moment, I'd be a little bit annoyed. In fact, believe it or not, like I wouldn't necessarily be the most... I probably wouldn't be the owner that gives everyone hugs. No, I might actually be the one who's a little bit stern. Like, you know what, son? Listen, son, this is my house, and while you're in my house, you know, I have certain rules that I live by. So what I'm going to ask you is this.
You have such a well-deserved reputation for being cuddly, Duncan.
This is where the snark does enter a little bit, though.
All right, let's go.
Is for someone who is definitely making illusions that he's somewhat critical of capitalism and even hinted at some sort of far left-leaning philosophical underpinnings.
It's not that kind of Marxist. It's kind of... You're going to have to watch it to see.
Even so, you're going to have to answer this question.
Sure.
Isn't that all about, you know, kind of like power to the people? Let's the workers kind of control the means of production and stuff. You know, I know that you're not there yet. You know, we're not in your utopia, but that seems like there's a conflict there. I mean...
Sure, from a political philosophy perspective, sure. Power to the proletariat, Duncan. But
not in this case, though.
in this case, right? Like, the number one lesson that I've learned from signing players is when you're negotiating a contract with a player, the only thing a player cares about is the salary and the length of time on the contract.
I will say also, by the way, that's where a lot of players have themselves done some shady stuff where they've complained about, like, I remember famously in StarCraft 2, it was always streaming hours. Like, oh, my team's asking me to stream. And then I would actually say to some of these players in private, didn't you literally negotiate a higher salary to get, and they said, okay, but you have to do more streaming. They'd say, oh yeah, but I thought I'd be able to do it. You know, that sort of like ridiculous, like, come on, man, take responsibility.
Right. And in the same way, right, like after the contract is signed, even if you are paying a player a ludicrous amount of money, that money in and of itself will not make that player happy. It's all the other things that makes the player happy, right? And I have this conversation with every player I sign where I'm like, look, I know you're asking for a higher salary now because you think this salary is the thing that will keep you happy, but I promise you having to stream 5 fewer hours a month is going to matter a lot more to you in 6 months than the additional $1,000 of salary that you want.
Sure.
Regardless, that very rarely actually works, and then they try to negotiate for a higher salary and then complain when I still hold them to the terms of the contract later on. That's aside. In this context, right, like why is it ludicrous for a player to decide where they would play? Well, number one, generally, and I'm not saying this is the same for every player, I'm sure there are some players that legitimately are willing to give up dollars of salary in order to have more autonomy and control. But in general, almost every player in esports and almost every player in professional sports will negotiate for as high a salary as they can get and give up as many rights as they can to get there, right?
I've even heard of players who gave up equity in their organization for the short-term higher salary.
Yep, that doesn't surprise me at all. And so, you know, even if I went to a player and said, hey, will you accept a salary of $5,000 less a month and you can pick where you play? Chances are the answer would be no. With that said, why is it important that the organization chooses where they play, where the players play? Well, the answer is because that the organization and the player have disaligned incentives, right? So a player might want to go play in the tournament with the highest prize money, right? Maybe they want to go play in a tournament in China with like a $3 million prize pool for Counter-Strike. Yeah. But the organization, because the organization very rarely keeps much of the prize money that the player wins, the organization has an incentive for the player to attend the events with the highest viewership, right? So we can sell sponsorships or that are held closer to where the organization is so that we can do cool local activations there, right? And so those incentives are just disaligned. And that's why it's a little ridiculous to think that like a player should be able to get the maximum salary, but also play wherever they feel like playing. Because if I'm going to shell out the highest possible salary for a player, which they are more in their right to earn, right? Because they have a great talent and they have a great brand, and they're going to help me a lot by being part of my organization. But then there needs to be a little bit of give and take for that partnership to work. And in order for that partnership to work, I need that player playing in the places that generates the most value for me in order to then go ahead and pay their salary. Right? If I'm going to pay a player $20,000 a month to play for me, I need to figure out how I'm going to earn that money. And I'm certainly not going to earn that money if that player is just choosing wherever they want to play. Like maybe one week they compete at the Weed Maps tournament and the next week they compete at the YouPorn tournament, and no sponsors want to touch my team because they're all competing in tournaments with like bad brands attached to them. So again, like not trying to be super snarky in this answer, any more snarky than you're being in the question. But like inherently when you, and I put this exact sentence, I think, in the responses I wrote to Scott way back in end of 2017. But like, if you are signing a contract as a professional player, you are giving up rights in exchange for money. Nobody is forcing you to sign that contract. You can go play as an unsigned player on an unsigned team and play wherever you want and whenever you want, and you never have to stream if you don't want to, and nobody can make you tweet anything, and you don't have to put #ad anywhere, right? But you're not going to get paid the salary. If you want to get paid a salary, then you're giving up rights. You're losing control over the roster, right? You don't get to pick whatever players you want to play with whenever you feel like playing them. You don't get to compete in whatever tournament you want, wherever you want to compete in it, whenever you want to compete in it. Sometimes you're going to have to promote sponsors that aren't paying you. They're paying the organization. You're going to have to stream even when you don't want to stream, because those are the things that generate value for an organization, that allow an organization to pay your salary and that allow an organization to run a sustainable business built on top of the labor of the players. If you want to talk more about Marxist political theory, right, like this is where a pure at heart communist would say, well, why are the players being exploited to build a business in which they do not hold ownership? And the answer is, well, like the money has to come from somewhere, right? If the players want to get paid money, then they need to deliver value for the money that they're getting paid.
Yes. And also, as you kind of alluded to, but didn't say explicitly, I mean, if this is such a reasonable offer, then I'm sure they can find an org elsewhere who'll pay them this salary, but give them all this control. Notice no one else is offering that directly.
Right, and this is where I get into the
reason why every org doesn't, because like you said, it wouldn't be in their incentive to do that.
Right, and this is where I take even more of an issue with like what Richard was saying about, you know, not letting the door hit CLG and Splice on the way out, right? Like, if it's so easy to run an organization and pay high salaries to CSGO players, then why aren't there more organizations paying high salaries to CSGO players, right? Like where are the organizations that are going to pick up the old CLG and the Splice teams, right? Where are they? Because they're not here right now. And sure, like the game will survive without them, but those players are not going to make as much money as they did before when those organizations leave. And look, I understand that might not impact Richard, but it certainly impacts the players.
Right, ignoring the world in which you can never say never and all these sort of vague statements, is it at all plausible that something like PEA is revived in the future and another attempt is made? Perhaps circumstances change. Is this something that's like actually, like, is there any kind of sentiment within the PEA teams that we could just try again in the future? Was it understood that, you know, it failed and it's over for now?
I think we'd certainly be open to it, though I think we'd probably need to see that re-engagement led by the players. If the players want to do it, I think we'd be open to do it.
Even though, I will say, by the way, I'm not an expert on American sports models. Like, I've followed some of those sports, and so I've picked up things along the way. And so I do know that, yes, obviously there are people who are owners who own teams that are in the NHL and the NFL and the NBA. You know, there's certainly multiple ownership, and it's not considered conflict of interest or anything like that. You know, it's considered separate businesses.
Sure.
Do you think in esports, if, like, for example, obviously the Overwatch League models, you have to have a different brand. Will we be in a situation in the future where you can still have a team like Immortals, which is the classic model of this is the multi-team organization, and you can get all the sponsors into Immortals, and, you know, maybe I sell this sponsor on this side of it and this one on the other side, and that's the way? Or will eventually one day, will it have to be, you could be the same owner, but you'll have to own totally different brands? What's your sense for where esports goes in that respect?
I don't think many publishers are going to force that to happen. The way that we're thinking about it is actually a little different than I used to think about it. Like, I used to think about it like, oh yeah, everything will be Immortals except for maybe LA Valiant. Now I'm kind of thinking about it as, like seeing the success of LA Valiant and seeing the way that we've been able to kind of cultivate a very specific brand to the very unique Overwatch community and the very unique Southern California community, I've recently started being more under the impression that it's better to have, when you're at scale, it's better to have kind of teams under their own brand. So having a separated brand for a team that is big enough to support one, because that allows you to take, very tailored steps for that brand that you couldn't do otherwise. Like, easy example is under old Immortals, right, with the League of Legends team and the Counter-Strike team. Like, the League of Legends team and the Counter-Strike team were like not really the same, right? They weren't really the same brand fit, and the players and their personalities weren't really that similar. And so in some ways, we kind of had to water down the Immortals brand in order to fit both teams. Whereas I think an ideal scenario actually would have been like separate brands for each, where for the Counter-Strike team, we would be able to create a brand and a voice and a fan base that is really tailored to that team. Like, can you imagine a team with Vito and FNX and the Twins that went really all in on this like bad boy image, WWE style, right? Like, that would be incredibly entertaining. But of course, like, could never do that for the more like, you can't play the heel in Counter-Strike and then play the face in League of Legends at the same time. Yeah. And I think that's a problem that a lot of organizations run into when they try to combine too many teams under a single brand. They just have to make their brand so generic so that it can fit all these different teams that it doesn't end up like actually working. Like, for me, I would fucking love a very specific brand tailored towards like Cloud9's Counter-Strike team. Like this very American, very like patriotic, red-blooded American brand that was just so focused and so pure and so kind of cultivated to that Counter-Strike team. And then, which,
by the way, would have a hilarious mismatch with having a London team.
Right.
If you wanted to go that route,
with a London team and then like an LCS team that has a lot of European and Korean representation on it, right? So that's not a perfect fit. And so I understand why they don't try to make Cloud9 mean both like hardcore patriotic American and memey fun LCS team all at the same time. Like, that's hard to do. But that's also why I think kind of uniquely tailored brands can be a lot more effective. Like that, having LA Valiant as just an Overwatch brand gives us so much more freedom in how to think about our voice and how to think about our fan base compared to trying to make it an Immortals Overwatch team while also having to balance Immortals Dota and Immortals Clash Royale and all that other stuff.
Okay, right. One last topic I had to talk about is, it's quite an abstract one, which is when you're a newer team that's come in. And I know for you, it might not feel like you are now because you've been in a couple of years, and obviously plenty of people came in after the fact, especially into places like the Overwatch League. We had brand new teams started that had no history in esports. With that said, though, to people like me, this is still one of the newer brands, and certainly in this particular respect I'm going to talk about now, you don't have this pedigree, which is you don't have the tradition, the prestige, the history that goes with being a TSM, or if you want to be in Counter-Strike, obviously there's some that go very far back. SK Gaming is probably a great example in that respect. One of the things I've noticed about that is, as much as if you'd have asked someone a few years ago before a lot of the money got involved, I'm sure there'd have been plenty of people who'd have told me, oh, that won't matter in the future because, for example, some of these brands might not survive. And so if they don't survive and there's newer brands and they win everything, well, then they'll have the history. That's certainly true, and that's a very fair point. But I will say a benefit of having that history, and I've seen this in traditional sports, is like, for example, so obviously one of the all-time great NBA franchises is the Boston Celtics. Now, they've had a number of years since the eras when they were winning many championships where they didn't. And in fact, sometimes they were not very good teams, and sometimes they weren't even playoff teams. But in that setting, the good thing about having that history is the second they do get a good team again, somehow that does all connect up again. You get to sort of tap back into the prestige and the history, and you get to pretend like, oh, we were always the team with the culture of winning, and that you can very easily resurrect that in terms of public image. But the flaw with being a new team obviously is you have to do that winning, and you have to establish that aspect. And so, for example, in your world, you've had business success and you've had some modicum of success in these games, but you haven't had the big championships, and you haven't had the same kind of equivalent of the banners you can hang and that you can point back to and say, we've got that prestige. So is that part important, do you think? Are you more aligned with the people where it's like, if we just succeed in business and eventually in the game, that will take care of itself? What do you think?
Well, if I'm reading between the lines, are you really asking me whether I think it's effective to perhaps revive legacy brands with competitive results in the past, but that have gone defunct?
I don't operate on rumors or speculation.
Oh, no, neither do I. I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question.
Yeah, that would be a good question, wouldn't it?
It would. I think the problem just is that, I'm pretty unfamiliar. I'm new to the esports space, and I just don't know a lot of those old legacy brands. Could you fill me in on some of the ones that might have had the most history that then fell out?
Well, the thing is, I was thinking when you were saying about having a team based around, like, you said Bad Boy Image because you picked like FNX and KNG, etc. But again, you interestingly picked like Cloud9 would be very like, warm-blooded, like we're Americans, we're patriots. Well, obviously, I would actually say a real flaw. This is a serious point, actually. I think one of the biggest flaws that all the big Brazilian teams have had, because they've all had their own scandals and their own moments when they didn't match up with their org, ethos and value system and stuff, even in the SK team and even when they were in Luminosity, where, that's a perfect example probably, right, of where you would want it to be a brand that is specifically saying, no, we are Brazilian. For good or for bad, that's what we represent here. We're going to align our values with that. Now, within that, yes, you obviously can't do some of the ridiculous things that have happened in the last few years. That will not be acceptable for any brand, but it definitely gives you a lot more room to play with these things, to be able to make positives out of what are currently, just because of the burden of circumstances, will be perceived as negatives with people having cultural mismatches, and not maybe even being able to live up to a certain brand that you have for a different team, like you say, in a different game. So people are under the impression that Immortals will do this with MIBR, made in Brazil, the classic, obviously the most famous brand from Brazilian Counter-Strike, and one that does have history because it did win a major, had a very good team for a while. In fact, it even was the first place where we saw Brazilians rise up in esports, to my knowledge,
Yeah. I mean, look, ESWC 2006 was a pretty seminal moment for Brazilian esports. Look, I think from my perspective, there's a certain distance a legacy brand can carry you if you can revive it and be true to it, right? And that's not just for defunct brands, right? Like, look at NIP, right? NIP
Absolutely,
went with their amazing record in the early days of Counter-Strike Go. Then they fell off for a while. Like, if NIP has a championship caliber team tomorrow, you will see NIP fans crawling out of the woodwork, even if they stopped watching Counter-Strike Go in the interim.
It'd be like that Joker meme, the one that was in League of Legends where all the CLG fans would take off like the jersey. It was the Cloud9 jersey.
Yeah,
the equivalent of that. That's what they'll all do. They'll all suddenly... You'll be amazed how many NIP fans there are again when they get back to the top.
Sure. And so I don't think that necessarily it's like this old brand just has fans because it's old and has legacy, right? I think it's more so the power of continuing a legacy, right? And so whether that's reviving a legacy brand or building a new legacy around a brand like Immortals or a brand like LA Valiant, I think really what drives people to become fans of a brand is the sense of identity and tribalism and kinship, right? Not just with that brand, but with the other people that are supporting that brand. And so with LA Valiant, we certainly aim to create a legacy of championship success, but very explicitly, we try to do it in Southern California and build a community of Southern Californians that are bonded together by their mutual fandom of the LA Valiant. And I imagine the London Spitfires will aim to do the same thing in London, just like NIP has always done in Sweden, right? I don't think that just the number of championships, the name of an organization has won matters, but I do think history matters, especially if that legacy can be continued.
Okay, right. At the end of this interview, do you have a final message for everyone or something you want to thank or say hello to?
No, not in particular. I guess I'd just say, like, stay tuned, working on a lot of fun stuff behind the scenes, and hopefully you get to see a lot of it hit the public view sooner rather than later.
That was the final third part of my interview with Noah Whinston from Immortals. Part 1 was about League of Legends. Part 2 was about Overwatch. And this third part was obviously about CSGO. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing. But I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.